under the fading silence of forgotten valleys, where the earth itself seems to carry the weight of secrets best left buried, there exists a story that was never meant to be told. A story so bizarre, so grotesque in its quiet persistence, that it feels less like history and more like a fever dream lodged into the bloodstream of America's past. Imagine this: two cousins bound by the same blood, fighting not with fists nor rifles, but with vows, each laying claim to the same woman, and she, instead of choosing, became the link in a chain that would lock their bloodline into a spiral of endless repetition. This was not a romance, nor a tragedy of passion. It was a binding of family to itself, a deliberate knot tied tighter with each generation until even the children forgot where brotherhood ended and fatherhood began. This clan was not hidden in distant castles of Europe. They lived here on American soil, in the kind of towns where barns rot before the people do, and secrets breed like the livestock that graze outside. Their story stretches across decades, a story that proves that sometimes the most dangerous dynasties are not crowned with gold, but with the dust of forgotten roads. Tonight you will hear of the cousins who married the same girl, and how their choices birthed the most inbred clan in history, a family tree so twisted it no longer resembled a tree at all, but a serpent devouring its own tail. When you look back at the earliest records, the names themselves begin to blur. Census sheets list the same surnames beside one another, repeating until the ink feels almost mocking, as though the government clerk himself could see the truth but dared not write it aloud. The cousins at the heart of this tale were raised in poverty, their world defined by narrow horizons and thinner opportunities. Yet what is striking is not the hardship. They were no different from countless other struggling families. It was the decision they made when it came time to marry. Instead of seeking wives from nearby towns, they bound themselves to the same woman, passing her between them not as a partner, but as a shared possession. The union was never public scandal, for it was hidden in plain sight. A marriage certificate here, a baptism there. Neighbors suspected, whispers grew, but no one had the courage to call it what it was. To speak it aloud was to acknowledge a decay that had already taken root. From their choices came children who carried bloodlines folded over themselves like creased paper, sons who looked too much like both brothers, daughters who bore the same crooked smile of a mother pulled in two directions at once. As generations passed, the repetition deepened. Cousins became brothers, became fathers in a cycle so tangled, the family tree became a closed circle, suffocating itself. What began with two men and one woman grew into a legacy of confusion, where birth certificates meant less than whispered confessions, and where the children themselves were taught not to ask too many questions. By the time outsiders tried to piece together the truth, the damage had already been done. Each face in the photographs carried subtle evidence, slightly uneven features, eyes that did not align, expressions that seemed locked between sorrow and vacancy. The horror was not just in the unions themselves, but in the silence surrounding them. This was a family that never needed outsiders to destroy them. They were dismantling themselves from the inside. As the years dragged on, the clan's story became less about individuals and more about survival inside their own creation. Every child born was both a continuation and a collapse, carrying the weight of choices made decades before their first breath. The cousins who once thought themselves clever in tightening their circle had instead laid a curse that bound every generation after them. Those children grew up in houses where family roles blurred like smudged ink on paper. Was the man at the table an uncle or a half-brother? Was the woman rocking the cradle a mother, or a cousin twice removed yet once again reclaimed? The words themselves lost meaning. In isolated valleys, the family withdrew further from society, turning inward as if ashamed of what they had become, yet unwilling to untangle it. Visitors would describe a strange stillness about their homestead, the way laughter seemed hollow, the way eyes lingered too long in silence. Even their land bore the marks of neglect, fields untended, fences sagging, as though the soil itself had given up under the weight of the bloodline that fed on it. Psychologists, years later, would look at the case with clinical detachment, diagnosing patterns of generational trauma, cycles of abuse, and cognitive decline. But stripped of academic words, what remained was a simple, chilling reality. The children of the cousins were growing up without the ability to see themselves as separate from the family machine that created them. They were born into bonds that felt more like shackles, condemned to live inside the walls of a house where love had been confused with ownership. And here is the darkest part, the silence of the surrounding community. Neighbors who saw, who knew, who whispered. A pastor who avoided eye contact when the family entered the church. Teachers who noted the peculiarities of the children but kept their comments to themselves. It was easier to let the family rot in secrecy than to confront them in daylight. Easier to pretend that what was happening in that house down the road was none of their concern. And so the clan's twisted story thickened, generation after generation, while the world around them looked away. By the third generation, the clan was no longer simply a family. It was a closed loop of blood. The children born from the cousins' shared bride were raised alongside half-siblings and cousins who were, in truth, far more than that. And when they grew older, they repeated the pattern they had inherited. They married within, sealing the circle tighter, turning kinship into a cage. To them, it wasn't unnatural. It was all they knew. The outside world was distant, threatening, even hostile. The family became its own nation, governed by rules unwritten yet absolute. Loyalty to blood above all else. But blood that thick soon becomes poison. Records and later studies describe how the physical toll revealed itself. The faces of the children began to bear unmistakable signs. Misaligned jaws, eyes that seemed to wander apart, frames too fragile to endure hard labor. Some were born silent, their lives ending before they could begin. Others carried the weight of genetic errors that left them marked for life, reminders carved into flesh of the choices their ancestors made. Yet within the clan, no one dared to call it wrong. To question was to risk exile, and exile meant death in a world they had long since abandoned. The cousins who started it all had long passed, buried under crooked stones in neglected soil, but their choices echoed in every crooked smile, every unsteady gait, every child who looked into the mirror and saw their uncle's face staring back. By then, shame was no longer private. Outsiders noticed, journalists whispered. A photographer once captured the clan in stark, unflinching black and white, and the images spread like wildfire through quiet American towns, proof that such things were not the stuff of European royalty or distant folklore. They were here, breathing, surviving, haunting the edges of the country. And yet, what strikes hardest is not the deformity, not the physical decay, but the emptiness in their eyes. Generations raised in cycles of confusion and silence, taught to accept what no child should accept, carried an expression that seemed to say, "This is all we have ever known, and it is all we will ever be." It is in this stage of the story that the silence begins to break, not by the family themselves, but by those who dared to peer too closely. Researchers, journalists, and wandering storytellers found their way into the valleys and alleys where the clan had hidden for so long. What they discovered was not just a family, it was an archive of generational damage written in human flesh. Every face told a story more chilling than words ever could. There were children who barked rather than spoke, men whose minds seemed trapped in endless cycles of confusion, women whose expressions flickered with a sadness too ancient for their years. The photographs became infamous. To outsiders, they were grotesque curiosities, glimpses into a world too broken to comprehend, but to those who looked closer, they were warnings, snapshots of what happens when love and lineage collapse into obsession with purity, with isolation, with never letting blood wander beyond its own veins. The cousins who once shared a bride could never have imagined their choice would become a symbol of American decay. Yet here it was, preserved in frames that no one could unsee once they had looked. The family's reputation spread like wildfire, and with it came mockery, horror, and exploitation. Strangers would travel miles just to catch a glimpse, to gawk at the clan as though they were an exhibit. But behind the cruelty of outsiders, there was a deeper terror, that this family was not unique. that countless forgotten valleys, countless hidden hollows, could hold their own stories of repetition and ruin, unseen because no one had bothered to look. And here is where I will ask you, if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have run, or would you have stayed, shackled to family no matter the cost? Because the truth is, for this clan, escape was almost impossible. The outside world had already labeled them, their blood had already betrayed them. And so the spiral continued. By the fourth and fifth generations, what had once been whispers became a legacy carved into bone. The cousins' decision to share a bride no longer lived as gossip. It had become prophecy, etched into the faces of descendants who could never choose the lives they were given. Every child born seemed like a copy of a copy, the ink fading with each repetition until identity itself wore thin. Those who tried to leave often returned, carrying the weight of their surname like a curse that no new town would allow them to outrun. The family homestead, once merely weathered, became a symbol of their entrapment. Rotting wood, broken windows, fences leaning like tired sentinels, yet inside, the cycle continued. Meals were eaten in silence. Children grew up under the watch of parents who were also their cousins, their aunts, their uncles. Stories of origins were deliberately left unfinished, for to speak the truth aloud was to risk shattering the fragile illusion that their lives were ordinary. But the illusion was thin, and the children knew it. They saw it every time they looked into a mirror and recognized too many faces staring back. Outsiders tried to intervene. Social workers filed reports. Teachers documented patterns of neglect and confusion. Yet bureaucracy moved slowly, and the family learned to hide just enough to avoid total exposure. The bloodline carried on in the shadows, sustained not by love, but by a kind of resigned duty. Generations bound together not because they wanted to be, but because no one had taught them how to live any other way. And so, the clan became both spectacle and warning. To historians, they are the embodiment of how secrecy breeds ruin. To psychologists, they are the living proof of trauma passed down like inheritance. To neighbors, they were simply that family down the road, too unsettling to confront directly. But to themselves, they were just family. Nothing more, nothing less. A closed loop that began with two cousins, one bride, and a choice that would echo for centuries. And now we reach the end of their story, or rather, the part of it that history dares to tell. The cousins who once believed they could bend family into something unbreakable instead birthed a dynasty that became a cautionary tale whispered across America. Their descendants still walk among us, carrying faces that betray the past even when the present tries to deny it. Every glance, every photograph, every unspoken silence is proof that blood remembers what we wish to forget. This clan is not merely a story of inbreeding. It is a story of human blindness, of communities too afraid to interfere, of silence stretched so thin it became complicity. The cousins who shared a bride may have thought they were preserving something, keeping blood pure, keeping family close. But what they preserved was decay, wrapped in the fragile skin of their children. They left behind not a legacy of strength, but a cycle of sorrow, a tree that devoured itself, root to branch. And here is the haunting truth. They are not alone. This is not just one family in one valley, but a mirror reflecting countless forgotten stories buried under American soil. Hidden records, faded photographs, nameless graves, families who chose silence over truth, and in doing so condemned their children to inherit their shadows. The most chilling part is not that this happened, it's that it could still be happening, in places just as quiet, just as overlooked. So when you hear the name of the cousins who married the same girl, remember what it means. It is not just gossip, not just grotesque curiosity. It is history carved into flesh, a reminder of how fragile blood becomes when it is folded over itself again and again, until even love becomes indistinguishable from ruin. Their house still stands, though few dare to approach it. The wind rattles the windows, the floorboards sag under the weight of years, and somewhere, In the silence, you can almost hear the echoes of laughter that was never innocent, vows that were never pure, and children born into a world where escape was impossible. That is their legacy, that is their curse. And now, it is yours to remember.